Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Eugenia from World Scientific, and I will be your host for the session today. My video camera is not turned on, so you are able to hear me but not see me. Before I turn on the video camera for Professor David Chan to deliver his talk, let me give you a brief introduction and explain some housekeeping rules for this session. First of all, thank you very much for joining us at this talk by Professor David Chan on the psychology of Singapore's response to COVID-19. Based on his newly published book, Combating a Crisis, The Psychology of Singapore's Response to COVID-19. This event is co-organized by the Singapore Management University and World Scientific Publishing and supported by the National Library Board Singapore. As most of you know, Professor Chan is Professor of Psychology and Director of the Behavioral Sciences Institute at SMU. His works, published in top journals, have been cited over 10,000 times in various disciplines. He has received many international awards, and he is the first scientist in the world to receive elected fellow status at all 6 international psychological organizations. In Singapore, he serves on numerous national councils, task force, scientific panels, international advisory panels, boards of directors, and he is recipient of several national awards for his contributions. He also writes op-eds in an invited column in the Straits Times, and he has been a consultant to Channel News Asia on several documentary series. We are indeed honored to have Prof. Chan here to speak with us today. Now, before we begin the talk, there are a few housekeeping rules to follow throughout the webinar. Please turn off your video camera and keep yourself on mute at all times throughout the webinar. If you have any questions for the Q&A session, please feel free to write it briefly in the chat box. This entire session is being recorded and also shared onto our social media pages, so please feel free to go to the World Scientific Facebook page if you would like to rewatch the webinar again or share it with your friends. Last but not least, Combating a Crisis is available for purchase on the World Scientific website and also in major bookstores across Singapore. Without further ado, I will now hand over to Professor David Chan, who will speak for about 20 minutes and followed by a question and answer session. Prof. Chan, please.
Thank you, Eugenia. I hope you can see me. Hi, everybody. I'm David Chan, as Eugenia from World Publisher has informed you. This is the first time I think we are doing this. Just for the record, it is not really a book launch, it is a book talk. As most of you would have known by now, this book is about the COVID-19 crisis, and I decided to write it quite recently, and then the book was published, in fact, in July. So it's just about a few weeks old. I think it is available on the website, available at the bookstores. And when World Publisher, WSPC, World Scientific, and we talk about having a book launch, obviously we cannot because of the physical restrictions of gathering. And then we asked ourselves, should we do an online book launch instead? And I said, well, maybe not. I think what we should do is a book talk. And the reason being that instead of publicizing a book, which is not the intention, perhaps the intention is for us to have a conversation. That's why we decided to do this live. I was told that right now we have about a few hundred people listening in, and I'm unable to see you, unfortunately. You can see me, I hope. And some of you are my friends, but there are many of you, according to the registration list, that I actually do not know who you are, and I apologize for that. But from the organizations or the occupations that you listed, I noticed that we have a few hundred people right now listening in who are from diverse segments of the population. We not only have academics, we have policymakers, we have people, of course, from the public, private, and the people sector. And there are just a few of us who are just logging in, just having an afternoon listening to a chat, a talk, and so on. So first, let me thank you once again for spending your precious Friday with us. What I'll do is I'll just spend the next few minutes, not too long, very casually, colloquially, informally, to chat with you about some of the ideas that I've written in the book, in order for us to reflect on not just the last few months that has happened quite dramatically to the world and to us, but looking forward and say, what can we learn from some of these lessons? And my purpose of doing this talk is really for us to think through, because it is really a protracted crisis, right? It is not something that that is just going to come and go in a very short while. And from all predictions, for the next year or so, not only we cannot travel for your holidays, there's going to be quite great disruptions in every aspect of our lives. And the way I see how we can organize our thoughts and reflection, whether it is for individual actions or for collective action or for policy making, or even as an employer or a co-worker, how do we navigate the harsh realities that's ahead of us? Perhaps is to look back and document and think through and reflect, how have we behaved? How have the government behaved? How has the businesses behaved? How have our family and friends and ourselves behaved? And the way we think, the way we feel, can we learn from these lessons in the past few months? Because if it is a protracted crisis, things that have just happened could very well happen again. And I'm referring not just to waves of infection. It could very well be, in the case of Singapore, that there could be another outbreak in the dorm. There could be an outbreak in the community when we have certain gatherings or when the physical restrictions are eased a bit further. And if we are complacent, if we are not socially responsible, or even if we are, and there could be things that happen, and we may find ourselves having to go through different types of restrictions again. It could also mean that those of you who have gone back to the office may not be able to, have to go back home and start working from home. It could also be the same business model that you have been working on and you thought it is fine, I'm going to revert back to my old business model, and then you find that you can't do that again. So perhaps the way to look at it is to organize the kind of information that we already know after the 6 or 7 months of outbreak into 3 types of issues, which I'll briefly share with you about. And then I hope to be able to pause and take live questions from you. Eugenia will be able to see the questions that you put into the chat box. I'm unable to see for technical reasons. And then I'll let Eugenia decide what questions to ask so that I get to hear from each one of you and try to address issues, perhaps issues that are not even listed in the book. Now back to the issues that we want to organize to reflect ourselves, to reflect about the issues. I tend to look at it as 3 broad issues. And the first issue is for all of us to understand the context of this virus. And the second issue to understand the leadership and the public responses in reaction to this crisis. And then the third type of issue is about the psychological preparedness for that all of us have to be prepared as we move forward, as we think and as we look forward. So the first issue is about the context. Now, by now, unless you're living in a cave, right, all of us know that it is a pandemic. By pandemic, if you take the epidemiological or public health definition, it simply means that when you have an epidemic that's already occurring in various countries in multiple continents, and then you get declared as a pandemic, like what WHO, the World Health Organization, did some months back. But I would say that this is really a crisis of pandemic proportions. And by that, I mean that it is not just a health crisis, right? By now, we all know that it is also an economic crisis. And even not just an economic crisis, it is really a crisis that has multifaceted dimensions. It has affected us sociologically, socially, politically, psychologically, and so on. And so it means that it is quite important for all of us to come together. It's not just a political propaganda kind of a statement to say, let's work together and emerge stronger together. I think the important point is for us to be a bit more humble, all of us, take a step back and say, there are things that I have assumed, things that I thought I knew. Perhaps I don't know everything and I don't know as much as I thought. And it is time to look around, look back on the assumptions that we have made, whether it is in organization, leadership, business, or just the way we relate to our families. And think through and ask ourselves, say, are there things that we could have done better? What are some of the things that we have done that in retrospect, we really shouldn't have done it? Not so much of hindsight bias, but actually over that, in the past, when you look at the information that we had, we could at that time have made another decision which could have been better. Right? So it's that kind of a humility that I hope that all of us can have, and the kind of a spirit that when we have, whether you are reading this book, an article, or speaking to another person, or having a meeting to review issues and so on. So the context of the crisis then, the pandemic crisis that we're in, the properties, if you like, the features of the crisis, it is very, very important. It is not something that is just meant for academics or public health professionals or politicians to profess about. But let me try and explain this. This pandemic is one that's undergoing exponential growth. So what that means is that if you just follow me here, if you have a graph that's on the x-axis representing time, it really means that when we say it is evolving rapidly, it is not a straight line, right? It is actually a curvilinear line. It is an exponential curve. It goes this way, and then it goes out very rapidly. So that is why it is not surprising at all for those of us who understand the statistics behind the spread, that within a few months, you find that the numbers get doubled in a shorter time. So we as in globally the world, actually managed to reach 10 million cases in about 6 months or so. And right now, in the 7th month, you already have more than 20 million, right? And it also means that if status quo, or if nothing is done, if people or government do not take precautions and continue to be complacent or become more lax, the cases could increase dramatically. And when that happens, it also means that governments have no choice but to take actions in order to protect its citizens. That means you could go back and revert back to lockdowns and so on. We have already seen this internationally. We saw this in Vietnam, we saw this in Hong Kong, even New Zealand, which has been a model. You find that just recently there are some cases again, and the government has decided to impose some kind of a restricted lockdown. So in Singapore, we seem to be pretty fortunate, as some of us would say, in the sense that while there are quite a number of cases in a relatively short time compared to the population, they are relatively contained within the dorms. Of course, it raises, second, a different issue about what's happening in the dormitories. In the case of the community, the cases are quite low. In fact, it has been falling at rather low and stable for the past few weeks. Just bear in mind that there are cases that are mild symptoms or asymptomatic. From all evidence, we can tell the virus is still in the community somewhere. And that is why you can continue to have community cases which are unlinked. There could also be people who get the virus, but because it's asymptomatic and you just rest and you recover from it. And there could be that time that you are actually also infectious. So I just want to take this opportunity to remind everyone that wearing your mask, social safe distancing, and all the safe management rules are actually as important, if not more important, than the previous months that we have been vigilant and so on. I think that's an important point for us to note when we think about the context of the COVID-19 coronavirus. Now, the second thing I just want to talk about is the leadership and the public reactions, right? And that presupposes, or rather premise on the important issue about adaptation demands. Now, what do I mean by that? It means that when we are confronted with this crisis, there's not just a crisis of public health, but economically, it has affected businesses, affected families, and in a very drastic way, because of the lockdowns and various fiscal restrictions on people movements and people mingling in the community, we find ourselves confronted with demands that we have never experienced before. Now, some of you I know will disagree with me and say, look, David, we have gone through various crises. We have gone through the SARS crisis. We have gone through September 11. We have gone through Asian global financial crisis, in about the last 17, 20, and even as recent as the last 10 years. Now, I would argue that all these experiences that we had, which we did well, we came back and bounced back quite quickly, are really qualitatively quite different from what we are going through now. For one, this is a very protracted crisis. The second, this is an extremely multidimensional crisis, unlike the previous crisis where the domains or the people who are affected are relatively contained. And in some sense, if you were to just spend less money, if you were to just hunker down, be more disciplined, be more prudent, when the crisis in the past blows over, we can come back and it's like business as usual. From all that we can tell now, I think people recognize that when this crisis is over, it's going to be quite some time. But even then, even if it's eventually over, things will never be back to a pre-COVID-19 status. So hence the term post-pandemic realities. What those post-pandemic realities are becomes important. But even before we get to the post-pandemic realities, you and I for the past few months have gone through various demands that are new to us, right? You know, in the past, some of us love to work at home, and we thought that working from home is wonderful and it is a privilege that belongs to only some select few. Now, after working from home for many months, some of you actually detest, you know, and don't like to work from home. And to be fair, even from day one, there are many families that find that working from home is really quite tough, especially when it coincides with HBL, right, the home-based learning, where you have to deal with, take care of your kids to make sure that things are okay, take care of house chores, and all happening at the same time where you are doing Zoom like this, having a meeting and having to meet the demands of your bosses, so on. So we were in a situation where the demands were completely novel to us. You know, I'm very sure that none of us have had the experience of having to work at home, not by choice, but by constraint for several months. Right? Just that alone is something quite dramatic for many of us. But much more important than that, right, the economic crisis, the SMEs, and that we're talking about almost 3/4 of the Singapore's population have gone through a very tough time. And that economic difficulties that the people have gone through actually spill over to many different parts of our lives, of the Singapore society, and it's not just an economic issue. And that is something that leadership becomes important, our public responses become important. How do we deal with some of these negative reactions that will happen? How do we enhance and make sure that there continues to be social responsibility? And how do we make sure that anything that is negative can be contained, can be dealt with very quickly? And also, for example, when we start having technology to do contact tracing, do people have that trust in what you say as a government, that you are respecting the privacy, that the information you collected, the way that you're dealing with it is indeed the way that you will actually deal with it. So issues of public trust, all this becomes important. And of course, you will need to read the book to understand my views or to get a sense of what I think is happening in the dormitories and how we have dealt with that successfully, but also at some parts where communications especially could have been much better. And those are very important issues, I think, for policymakers, public servants, some of you are probably listening in right now, to reflect on. Because as time goes by, remember the same things can happen again. And when the same things happen again, we really need to do better than the first time that we did, because we all should have learned from the consequences of certain mistakes or certain things that we should have done otherwise. And so the first issue, as I said, is the context of the virus, the pandemic that we need to understand. The second issue is about the importance of leadership, the importance of trust, and the importance of the public responses in terms of being socially responsible, how to handle the negative reactions as we adapt to the various demands. And the final thing that I just wish to say is the notion of psychological preparedness. Many of us will just use the term, say, resilience, let's go through with it and so on. It is really much more than that, right? The good news is that if you were to reflect back on the various months that we have gone through, even people who found themselves in difficulty took time, not just to appreciate our frontline workers, but also took time to help out with people who are in need. In fact, to seek them out, right? Not just our friends, but even strangers. And that kind of positivity that all of us have in sort of innate in us, it is a very effective counter to the negativity that we sometimes have no choice but experience with the difficult demands that come along. And in the book, what I try to explain is that there is no contradiction to feel negative sometimes, and sometimes you really ought to feel negative when things are not right, with the notion that we need to enhance the kind of positivity that all of us have as individuals, as groups, as organizations, or collectively as a society. So in the third part of the book, what I did was try to let us take a step back, think through about the positivity constructs that we all know about actually, and how to apply that in our personal lives, apply that, of course, at the workplace, and also apply that in your policy making, in your communications for those of you who are policy makers. Because it's a protracted crisis, positivity is just critical. I think if we are not aware of positivity, and if we don't start enhancing positivity, I think it is very difficult for us to develop the social and psychological capital that we need, right, for the country to emerge stronger and for the country to actually go through this crisis. There are going to be a lot of practical things that, to be sure, there are going to be a lot of practical difficulties, right, that we will face. Let me just give you a quick example, because I noticed that while it is being talked about in mainstream media, maybe less so in social media, I don't think it has been given the kind of attention that it deserves. You notice that during the crisis, and it's still ongoing, there are many people who have lost their jobs, and we are very concerned, and everyone is very concerned, right? Both the people and the government, with people from lower income families. And you want to make sure that they are taken care of, you know, that they can still have their meals, they can pay their rent, and things are okay with them on a very basic sustenance basis. But I think what we have forgotten also is that it's not just the lower income, right? There are people who are in what we call the middle class, even the upper middle class, that as a result of the crisis, you could have closed down your business, you could have lost your jobs. It is quite a different set of issues altogether, because what happened is that for many of these people who have been getting a very decent salary all their lives, suddenly when they move from a state of self-reliance to a state of a dependence. And when you're in a state of dependence, when we're not careful, when things are not clear, you might first not get the help that you need. And second, you might actually lose the dignity that you have. So it is very important, I think, for the government, for the organizations and employers to recognize that the people that we have been dealing with, the people that, you know, that we have been dealing with on a day-to-day basis, where you think that everything is fine, you can take care of yourselves, might not be quite true, right? In the next few months or even the 1 or 2 years to follow. It is important for us to be sensitive to their needs, needs which traditionally we think that it will not occur to them because they are self-sufficient individuals, so to speak. So that is something that I think we need to give much more attention to, both in the media, in policy making, as employers and co-workers. We will need to look out for each other. I would love to go on and on, but I don't think I should. The purpose really of having this the purpose of having this book talk is to really get a conversation going with all of you. And I hope that all of you could be very frank and ask questions by typing into your chat box. Any questions that come into mind, we probably cannot address all questions. I'll leave it completely to Eugenia to select the questions and then can speak aloud so that everybody can hear the questions. And we try to deal with these issues, each one of them, as much as we could in the remaining 20 minutes we have. So we are on time. We have exactly 21 minutes now to take some of your questions. Thank you, Eugenia. Can I hand it back to you?
Thank you very much, Prof. Chan, for your insightful comments. Let us now begin the Q&A session. I can see that we already have quite a few questions from our live audience. So the very first question is from Justin, and Justin says, question for Dr. David Chan. Amid the health pandemic and an economic depression on the brink of occurring, was COVID-19 a gift, so as to speak, that it polarizes the structural changes that are already occurring even before COVID-19, and that COVID-19 was the catalyst of that forced Singaporeans to adapt and transform digitally? On top of that, do you see Singapore coming out stronger mentally after this COVID-19 crisis, especially those growing up and entering the job market as a fresh grad? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Justin. I think your question really has 4 questions in it, right? The idea of generally, is this a plus or a minus? And secondly, whether structurally it actually is useful, right? It's a blessing in disguise, so to speak. And you gave the example of digitization, right? Where Singapore and many other countries are trying to push us towards not just cashless payment, but to make use of digital electronic communications, ICT, right? Information communication technology much more. And the assumption is that there have been some resistance either by employers, by different segments of the population. And this COVID-19 is therefore a blessing in disguise. It has catalyzed and forced us to go ahead and do that. But in so doing, which is the third and fourth question, whether people are affected, are there going to be some people that's going to fall behind and do better or do worse? So I'm not sure if I can take all 4 questions, but let me just say this, right? In most crises, there's always plus and minuses. The very obvious thing is that the initial reactions, as you will notice, what I try to say in my book is that you must pay attention to the negatives first. Because in a crisis management, any good leadership will know that if you are not paying to the situation about preventing the adverse consequences from happening, and when you let it happen, when it is actually preventable, there is no chance to talk about positivity later because you simply cannot bounce back, right? So I think most governments in the world, except for some which I shall not name, most governments in the world actually did the right thing by very quickly ring fencing by very quickly doing lockdowns, either partial lockdowns or full lockdowns, contact tracing people, and having what we call relatively harsh fiscal restriction kind of rules. Whether you are from an Eastern or Western culture, they proceeded with it. And I thought those were very important and correct things from the public health perspective, as well as from an economic perspective, because if we don't take care of the public health situation and let it run out of control, we cannot talk about bouncing back economically and so on. So it is never an either or. You take care of the life first. Without a life, you can't have livelihood. And so it was right in the first few months to focus so much attention on the life, and sometimes even at the expense, right, requiring businesses to close down. And by and large, I think people are reasonable. They understood that situation. But you cannot maintain this situation forever, and hence you needed to focus back on the economy to bounce back because people need livelihood and so on. Now, the plus that Justine talked about is about the digitization. I think it's a yes or no. Clearly, for those of us who refuse to learn Zoom, and some of you have now learned Zoom because now you're with me, myself included, right? I've never used Zoom before the COVID-19, and now we know how to use Zoom, and that has been helpful. Without Zoom, it's not so easy for me to have an audience of several hundred listening to me right now, and then I could only share it with a more limited group of people. So clearly, what the COVID-19 unintended positive consequence that has happened is that it made digitization, the good things about digitization happening faster than it should because we are forced to do it. So you talk about communications, talk about delivery and so on. But remember, the faster you do it, when we are not careful and when you don't have a caring and a good government to take care of things, there will be people who will get left behind, right? People who are not necessarily just elderly folks, but people who may not just be having conducive environment to do things electronically. If we don't take care of these individuals and these families, then you will see the larger the digital divide. In Singapore, we are pretty okay because I think government, NGOs, and people do pay attention to this widening digital divide. And as we move along, we just make sure that nobody is left behind. So it is not a given that things will all be positive, but what we can do is to ensure that the positives to be and the positives don't turn into negatives. Eugenia?
All right, so another question from Alice. So Alice is wondering, what is the psychological impact of how people view work moving forward? And what are some tips you might want to give to the leaders?
I suppose leaders, you meant leaders in the organization, but actually it will also mean national leaders, right? Our political leaders, because they have a great say and a great impact in their policy and decisions on a day-by-day basis to affect how organizations structure their businesses, structure their work, and so on. I think the psychology of work, of course, it's multidimensional, but the psychology of work is pretty important. Let me just go back to the example I gave, right? The example that that your traditional groups that you are vulnerable. We tend to think about vulnerable groups as elderly people, people who cannot fend for themselves. You think about low income. You think about people with various physical or mental disabilities. Yes, these are vulnerable groups. In fact, because precisely they are well-defined vulnerable groups, government and NGOs pay a lot of attention to them. So in the history of our country, I think we are quite confident that we will try our very best to make sure these individuals don't fall behind too much and make sure we equip them with the necessary skills, not just for survival, but to actually do well subsequently, to have a social mobility, to have a good quality of life, so to speak. Recall that I mentioned that there are many of us who may classify ourselves as middle class or upper middle class, doing very well. You could even be staying in a private housing estate. But things have changed so much that suddenly you find yourself in both economic and social difficulties. Now, these are the individuals I think we need to be very, very careful. Now, recall that we have a Jobs Council started, chaired by Senior Minister Tharman, where we are going to have trying to create job opportunities, traineeships, so that you can transit and take up something before you move on to a permanent job and so on. The message will be, and I can understand the message, is that we should not be choosy, you should learn to adapt and you should take up the jobs. But you also need to understand, you meaning all of us, need to understand that it is not easy for somebody who has been living a life of self-reliance for many, many years, having a decent salary with a mortgage to pay and a family to support, to suddenly change and do a job where you are quite skillless, where you don't have the necessary skill to do it for long. What will happen? Well, people may just not do the job, or when people who do the job, they will not actually perform well. So when you ask about the question of the psychology at work, it might sound fluffy to you, but I would say it is totally critical for us to ensure that as we create jobs, as we find people and move people to jobs, never forget the importance of the fit between your job demands and the job skills and the interests that you have. Because those interests, while you can develop, there are some sets of things that you can match and some sets of things you can't match. Now, what can we do as co-workers or employers in the organization? You can do relatively simple things that are free of charge. You can make your job, redesign the job so that it's more meaningful, so that when the worker is doing it, the worker continue to feel motivated because you are able to use the skills that you have and able to work with people to accomplish a task and see how the task relate to what I'm doing. So the sense of responsibility, the sense of autonomy, the sense of meaningfulness in a job is absolutely critical. It will continue to make us motivated to learn new skills, to stay in the job, to do well, and so on. So don't take this as a transient things and don't send a message that everybody please lower your expectations. Yes, we need to be realistic in our expectations, but it doesn't mean that we need to sacrifice the meaning of work, because the purpose of work, and remember this for all employers and all psychologists or policymakers, we must make sure that through work, we enhance our human dignity and develop it, and not through work, you diminish the dignity that we have. Eugenia?
Yep, right. So the next question is, Singapore has been doing very well in handling the pandemic compared to many other countries. So why do we still hear so many criticisms? Do you think these criticisms are ignorant or unfair?
Well, that question is quite tough because you started with a premise that Singapore is doing very well relative to other countries. Is that a fact? Well, it is a fact from many perspectives, but it may not be a fact from other perspectives. If you look at death rates, we are exceedingly low. We are very good, and that's because of our wonderful, not just healthcare facilities, but the healthcare workers that we have, their commitment and so on. But it's also because of the ecosystem, the healthcare ecosystem, right? Whereby it is very well linked with other public services, linked well with contact tracing. We are very good in our contact tracing, and also with the political and civil service leadership that dare to make difficult decisions. So it is a whole health ecosystem that we have built up. And so we managed to actually on the healthcare front, did very well in contact tracing, in the quality of the healthcare. Now, from that perspective, I would say that we are among the top in the world. And that is something that you don't just accomplish overnight, right? It took foresight to build up. But then there are other things that some people will say that, well, how did the large number of infection occur at the dormitories? There are various perspectives to it, right? I can't go into detail given the little time that we have. But as I try to say it in the book, that there are some things that we could have controlled better, but there are other things that we actually did extremely well. So whether we did well compared to other countries, it very much depending on who is evaluating it and which aspect of the issues that we are looking at. It is true, right? Compared to many other countries, we have been doing pretty well in many dimensions, but don't let that get into our heads, and be complacent and say, we are wonderful and so on. And bear in mind that even if we have done really well, we have to open our borders at some point. It's 20.5 million right now, and all over around us, there are many infections. We can't close your borders for too long, right? And then soon you have to deal with imported cases, community cases, and so on. So I think that is kind of a reality check when we make the assumption that we have done relatively well to other countries. So I'll just end this answering this question with one more point. And that is that the question seems to also assume that why Singaporeans or people living in Singapore, could be Singaporeans, PR or foreigners, tend to be very harsh, right, with either the authorities on how we manage the crisis. Because the question says, why are we criticizing? Are we ignorant? Are we unfair? In every country, yes, there will be some very negative criticisms of the authorities, of everybody in fact, that are ignorant, that are unfair. And that happens in every country, and there's no reason to think that Singapore will not have a segment of people that adopt that attitude. But I dare say that that is a statistical minority, that most people, when they criticize, it is not based on ignorance or unfair, right? It was based on a contextual situation that you were completely affected by the crisis, and there are lots of uncertainty, it was volatile, and the situation was such that the response, either in policy or people or yourself or your family, were not meeting those demands and those challenges adequately. And in the absence of good communication, then the criticisms arise. So I would argue that don't blame it on the people, the critic, being ignorant or unfair. There will be some, but understand why those criticisms occur, especially when those criticisms are occurring and they are surprising to you because you thought that you have been doing very well. When I say you, it refers not just to policymakers, it could be an employer of an organization and so on. Right, so I want to take these opportunities to call out to those of you who have some influence, right, in leadership positions, to not try to, whenever possible, externalize the problems. Right, the first step is to have the humility to say, hey, could it be me? Could it be my policy? Could it be my leadership reaction that actually caused this? As opposed to saying that, oh, people are full of negativity in the way they criticize, they are ignorant, they are unfair. You know what we need to avoid in the country and everywhere else is a kind of destructive cynicism. People who just criticize with no good reasons, right, regardless of the facts. But what we want to promote is actually not just positivity. What we want to promote is also a sense of healthy skepticism, because we need a population that are able to discern, right, to be able to know that when someone says something, what is the evidence for the claims? We need to ask, because transparency and accountability are important. Once we adopt that attitude, things will be much better, you know, and you want to turn the person with a healthy skepticism to one who is actually positive, understand the situation, do well, and then we can work collectively together. And then you can talk about notions like emerge together stronger and so on. Gina?
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Chan. Since you mentioned borders reopening, I have a question here about that. So from AC, he's asking, COVID will be here for a while, and where the borders reopen, we may see spikes after spikes until a viable vaccine is available at a large scale. So we can be looking at years. How do you think the government can help sustain, and for how long, with the help of measures and relief packages? Or how can it tweak the current approach? After all, the governmental surplus are not unlimited, and income tax receipts will fall as more lose their jobs or switch to lower paying jobs.
Yeah, the person asking these questions sound very much like from the Ministry of Finance. So I'm just joking, right? It is true, right? And it's a very good question, because I don't know how much reserves we have. We don't know, right? But no matter how much reserves we have, it is a limited reserve, right? You can't possibly use up all your reserve for one crisis, because a subsequent crisis may occur and so on. It is also not right to keep on using a reserve. Remember, I talked about self-reliance. You know, there are many people who are not just there waiting for money to drop from the sky or given by the government. There are many people who want their problems solved. And what they want is that to have the kind of money to be able to tie through a period, to have the kind of opportunities to restart your business, to go back to work, to take care of your children, take care of your elderly parents, and also to find your own job so that you become not just independent, self-reliant, but be able to lead a good quality of life by your own motivation and your own effort. The psychology tells us that that is true of all of us, right? And don't ever have the mentality that, you know, Singaporeans are all just waiting for money to drop from the sky. I don't think that is true. And I think the government recognized that, and hence the government actually took a very drastic step, right? In not just the amount of money you withdraw, they withdrew from the reserves in the 4 budgets that was given up in a very, very short time, but also in terms of policy ideologies, right? The underlying the ideology, you are giving out people, giving money to masses, right? In fact, you read in the papers that you were giving out money to people sometimes without requiring them to produce any documentary proof, which is something that's entirely unusual of most governments, and especially our government, who are very particular about doing things systematically, being a good stewardship of public money and so on. So the point to remember is that we don't know when some of this help is going to stop. At some point, it will have to stop. What is important for the government and the policymakers to recognize is that, you know, you just can't win people and say, I stop giving you money, you're on your own. You need a graduated approach, right? Aggregated approach, whereby you need to have something in place of that, right? And that's why you have the situation of not just having job fairs, but able to try to match people with jobs, get people trained with the necessary skills. And the very harsh decision that the government has to make is to sort of allow some sectors to die off because it is not viable, in order to make sure that the people in these sectors have the time and skills developed to move on to other sectors, and then continue to do well. I think those are the difficult challenges. On paper, in theory, it is simple to say, simple to talk about. In practice, it is going to be very, very difficult. I should just make a point, since in last week, there was a news that Ministry of Manpower has been releasing information, going to decide to release information on a weekly basis about jobs in order to help people to get jobs, know what skills you need to pick up and so on. That is a pretty tough thing to do, to release information weekly. I would suggest very much to the ministry to think through how do you want to release information quickly, promptly, but may not need to be weekly, and also what kinds of information you want to release, because there are some macro indicators information. They are not useful for the individual to make decisions about your career choice, about shall I go into this sector and so on. So we need to ask ourselves what kind of information that individuals need. And then we release those information so that they are not flooded with all kinds of information that actually may not end up being useful to them. Right? So that is important, I think, issue, right? That as we try to help and release more information, we release useful information that is important. I should also add that it is not the number of job fairs that we hold that is the KPI that is important, the key performance indicator, because these are activity-based. They are not irrelevant, they are useful. Without job fairs, you cannot reach out to people, but these are outreach indicators. What you need is to make sure that you have impact and outcome indicators. There must be a way of tracking that all these efforts and money that we have put in, or you have put in as public service, you are indeed matching the people to the jobs. They are actually getting good prospects, they are getting the proper training that eventually they're likely to going to turn them into some permanent jobs and so on. So try and make sure that as we continue to have activity-based kind of KPI, have a very good measurement and tracking system, right, to follow through to make sure that we understand the outcome and the impact are actually the intended ones, and not have a whole flood of unintended negative consequences. Gina?
All right. I think that's about all the time we have. Let me just round the Q&A up with this final question. Prof. Chan, so what is the most important impact or change that you hope your book will bring about?
Okay, so it's the last question. You get back to the book. I don't really want to say too much about the book, because I think some of you have already read the book, I heard, and the book is freely available that you can get access to. But I do want to share with you, since the question is being asked about the impact of the book, we kind of go back to the chapter 1 of the book of trying to explain to my readers why I write the book. I think when you think about a crisis like this, unlike, say, even SARS or the Asian financial crisis, where it is relatively short, it is a protracted crisis. Now, if we don't start documenting things that happen, like in a book, and don't document it honestly, accurately, and if you don't try to explore the kinds of actions that we have taken that could be improved on, and if we don't talk about the underlying psychology, what that means is that if you wait until the pandemic is over and you start doing a review and you start talking about it, it is too late, right? Over the 1-2 years, there will be so many people's lives who have been affected negatively because we have not reflected. And there will be so many of us that could have done things better had we given alternative perspectives and so on. So that was the purpose of why I decided to write the book in a very rare situation of doing it in a very short time, very quickly, when we are still in the early stages of the book. And I hope, to the question, right, I hope that the impact of the book is that it will make us reflect. You don't, of course, you don't, and you probably won't agree with everything I said in the book, and that's not the point. The point is that to have it documented as accurately as I could about what happened, provides you the basis of what we know from science about what psychology tells us of how we can do things better, about how we can counter, for example, negativity with positivity, how we can be better in our policy communications to ensure that we build trust and so on. So that when things happen again, and it could be very soon, we can do it better. In fact, I think I will be extremely pleased if you read the book more than once. And that is because when you read the book the second time, compared to the first, you have accumulated real life different experiences. And then if we can reflect back from some of the ideas or perspective in the book, and then we can ask ourselves, could we have done things differently? Maybe the first time you read the book, it is quite different from the second time, and hope that it is a more positive situation because you are able to apply some of the ideas, or some of the ideas approach or appeal to you in quite a different fashion. So I will just conclude that the purpose of this is not a book talk really, right? It's not even a book launch, right? And the purpose of this, I think, is to start a conversation for us to be courageous in speaking up what we feel and what we think, and be constructive in the way we do it, so that all of us can come together and have what I have been calling the HLC. You know, HLC is the acronym that I've been advocating for many years. Right? H is humility, because without humility, you can't learn. And L is your learning orientation, that we need to learn things that we don't know. And C is your collaboration. So before we can get people together to work together, we really need to have HLC, that the humility, the learning orientation, and then we can talk about collaboration. And with that, I think the notion of working together, emerging stronger, can really make sense. I hope in this short time, I've helped some of us to rethink some of the ideas. It is kind of incoherent in a short time to cover something as proportional as a pandemic. But I'm sure if there are interest, you know, we can have more of such sessions again. I'm done. I think, Eugenia, can I hand it back to you?
All right. Thank you again, Prof. Chan, for addressing all the audience questions and also taking the time today to do this talk for us. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of today's session. So on behalf of the organizers, the Behavioral Sciences Institute at SMU, the National Library Board of Singapore, and also World Scientific Publishing, thank you for joining us today, and have a very lovely evening. We hope to see you again for another session soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.